issues in black are more commonly addressed in policy environments, especially in STI policy. But more and more we see policy paying more attention to wicked problems, to long-term opportunities and threats, scenarios and visions, which is one of the areas in the anticipatory work of foresight, and long-term strategies and roadmaps. And even more now with the pandemic and many other wildcards that we are facing, we recognize the importance of wildcards, the hidden issues, fake news as well, weak signals and moonshots in policy implementation. The third type of complexity is about the impact of those events that I mentioned before. And there is an increasing understanding in policy domains as well that the impacts are multidimensional. We cannot just look at the technological impacts of some issues. We need to look holistically at the economy, the environment, society, and political impacts as well as ethical. Then we face the issues of multivariable complexity when one particular event triggers many others in a domino effect. Or we end up in a field or in a territory where catastrophe comes into play, or different types, this is the butterfly effect, when a small change in a variable changes the ecosystem. And this is one of the most complex systems. How do we define what we love, what we hate, who we marry? Where do we want to work in the future? Do we want to stay in our current workplace? Do we want to move? What type of projects would you love to be involved? So it's very complex, and there are multiple variables that shape our decision-making activities. And here comes the second part. Collective intelligence has been growing, and in this conference and in previous conferences have been one of the core elements and topics. And taking this into account, at VTT, Technical Research Center of Finland, we launched a few months ago a internal project called Foresight Reloaded, kind of like mimicking a little bit the feeling, or trying to make it also fun for us to think in terms of the matrix, and find ways in which we can reload some of the successful activities that we did. European Commission funded project, European Foresight Monitoring Network, 10 years ago. We mapped thousands of foresight best practices around the world, and then taking more of an inductive approach, we drew some lessons. I'm happy to see Michael Keenan would be speaking here today, because we actually, back then, 2008, we wrote an article on 6 world regions and comparing how foresight is done in different world regions. And this type of work has not been done systematically since then. So we decided to start with a project we call Foresight Reloaded, and combining multiple approaches, real-time Delphi, different type of surveys, case studies, and mapping, a la Mapping Foresight a decade ago, a wide range of interviews, and trying to build a compendium of research fish to build the competencies and skills of BTTers. And at the same time, an old idea, which thanks to the pandemic as well became a project, we managed to mobilize what we are now calling the Universal Foresight Ecosystem, Research and Innovation Ecosystems, even a group of 6 editors and 12 members of the advisory board, which are listed there, and top universities, several of them in Europe, but also in the US, and in South Africa, as well as RTOs, research and technology organizations. We started a research and innovation initiative. The main purpose of this is to advance knowledge, and advance knowledge in terms of how best cases at the moment, what cases can we learn from in terms of application areas. We're looking at foresight applied to science and research policy, one of the areas. Technology development, the conventional technology foresight activities, foresight for sustainability and society, foresight for businesses and organizations, also territorial foresight and urban development foresight, as well as foresight addressing wicked problems such as climate change and moonshots. And it has become, or is aiming perhaps to become a grassroots initiative with people signing up and mapping. But in our internal project, as well as in the book project, we are not aiming for quantity, but for quality. So our goal is to map the best top 10 cases in each of these categories, also by areas of science, looking at Frascati taxonomy, top 10 cases in social science, in engineering and technology, in humanities, medical and health science, natural science and agriculture, as well as all 6 world regions. At the moment, we have nearly 50 cases in the database, and we are aiming to continue collecting and mapping cases by the end of the year. At the same time, we are building a database, or what we call a methods bank, and we're trying to reload and try to understand foresight methods, how they have evolved and changed, and what are the future of foresight methods. And in so doing, we are building a stock taking as well of foresight players, the sponsors of foresight, organizers and practitioners, trying to understand with a focus on practices, outcomes and players in a 15 to 20 minute survey, which is open. The link is below, and you can find more information as well in the portal. 5 parts of the survey: general information about the respondent, and then going straight forward into foresight experience and know-how. What are the competencies and skills that we need in the future, in the next 10, 15, 20 years? What are the foresight potentials to contribute to the sustainable development goals, and additional inputs and insights on best practices we should be mapping? How to join this movement and the initiative? You can go to universalforesight.com and sign up in the top right corner. Now, moving towards the end of my presentation, how do we plan to transfer the knowledge that we are gathering? What is our strategy? At the moment, we are looking in combining different approaches. As I mentioned in the Mapping Reloaded project, we are looking into using data analytics and literature reviews and doing analysis of the most cited papers in foresight and technology foresight, horizon scanning, futures research, and future studies in the last 20 years. So these are some preliminary results of the first search, the top 20 most impactful or cited foresight and future studies publications in the last 20 years. But we don't want to stop there, because most of the important as well issues that are shaping and shaking the world are emerging from weak signals. So most cited and more impactful publications are good to understand what has been produced in the field the last 20 years, but we also need to pay careful attention to those who are cited only a handful of times, because they might also have great ideas, and we don't want them to be under the radar. But we're starting to combine data analytics in order to reload and write the kind of like the next version of the handbook of technology foresight. We are calling it the Handbook of Universal Foresight, with 6 editors. And a byproduct, which became also a request by Edward Elgar, was to produce a handbook of foresight methods, which is also on the way. And both projects are expected for next year. So we are expecting to transfer the knowledge through these books, but we're also expecting to co-create those books. So there are 2 parts in the first book on methods that are pretty much defined by a number of decisions that we're making at the moment. But there are 8 parts that we will be soon opening for public contribution. So if you are interested, please contact me regarding foresight methods, because there will be 44 methods featured in this handbook. And similarly, in the Universal Foresight handbook, there are 3 parts of the book, which the editors are deciding and targeting contributors, but there are 3 parts where you can find an open call already in the website if you feel like contributing on foresight practice by world regions, by type of application, and areas of science. So the black boxes show the chapters, 18 chapters that are open for contributions, and we're going to close this by the end of this month, the call. To conclude, and the way forward, there are multiple problems, wicked problems, wildcards, and moonshots that many actors know that need to be assessed and managed. And that assessment and management requires anticipatory and collective intelligence in order to build resilience and to promote sustainable futures. In this session, we're talking about STI policy and the strategy cycle. So STI policy requires, and the cycle requires careful policy formulation, so policy and strategy setting and strategy description. Foresight and future studies help through anticipation to define those policy and to set those strategies and to anticipate those futures. When we're looking into the second phase of the policy cycle realization, which involves strategy implementation and dissemination, then the recommendations, the recommending phase of foresight is very important to develop those sound and robust advice based on multiple stakeholders' insights in order for the implementation phase to take part. And finally, last but not least, foresight is also important in the phases of policy and strategy monitoring and evaluation. The phase what I call transforming or transformation. So that's what the art of foresight is all about. You don't anticipate only to stay with fanciful scenarios, but you anticipate to recommend and to transform. And that transformation is very important in order to really assess and manage those wicked problems and those opportunities and to take the right actions into place. And my last slide, before I thank you for your attention, I would like to highlight a few important ways in which you can join this wave. Number one, you can join the ecosystem by going to the link provided. There is an open call for chapters where you can submit an abstract by the 30th of November. And you can see also in the slides, which I guess are going to be disseminated later on. If not, I will put them in my blog, where you can see the timeline for the chapter contributions. We're also launching a call for cases in all these areas, and the deadline for submitting cases is the end of the year. Those cases, the best practices and the most interesting ones and relevant for the book will be featured in the book. So if you don't feel like contributing to a chapter, but you would like your cases, your existing or recently completed foresight project to be featured in the book, please feel free to join and map the cases in the UFO, the Universal Foresight Observatory. Then you might also contribute to the survey, and the survey will also close at the end of the year. And if you would like to be interviewed because you have recently completed a project or participated or read about an interesting paper or project that you think that we should be taking into account, you can self-nominate yourself by sending me an email, and we will interview you before the end of the year. The idea is that we will be gathering and co-creating knowledge until the end of the year, and then we have a schedule of completing, drafting the chapters, and together with 6 editors and an international advisory board, which I mentioned, with 12 members, we are aiming to complete this project by the end of next year. Of course, many of the activities that are ongoing lead to multiple spin-off. For example, already in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an executive education course, 3.5 days in Manchester, Foresight in Action, which is in a way partly a spin-off of the project where we've been mapping cases. So I invite you as well to visit the news of the portal. Then the second spin-off is a special issue on data-driven insights on foresight that we might be discussing with our colleagues in HSE in the coming weeks. And based on the data analytics work that I'm doing with some colleagues at VTT, Arjo and Arash are part of the data-driven foresight and quantitative future studies that we have at VTT, and we're looking into those publications and way in which we can understand through network analysis the most cited, the most impactful activities, as well as the players around the world. And finally, today I was in discussion with Edward Ergar, but also Springer, possibility of a book on foresight in Iberoamerica with 4 other colleagues. So there are many ways in which we can think of different spin-off projects around this, but the main purpose of Universal Foresight is to, again, create a research and innovation ecosystem whereby we jointly generate knowledge through collective intelligence, and then we, through collective as well, knowledge transfer strategies such as the books, publications, special issues, and executive education courses, we can transfer this knowledge. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rafa. So this is right on time, sharp at the minute, which is highly appreciated. It's always a pleasure not to intervene and remind that we are running short of time. So I would suggest we continue with Valeria Vlastova and Vitaly Root. Valeria, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, wonderful. So who is presenting, you or Vitaly? It's you.
I will present today our joint work. Let me
So we continue talking about cooperation. So what Raphael started, cooperation, we continue here in the open innovation. It's like a network style for the book what you have in mind. Valeria will tell us a bit more about the networks. So the floor is yours, Valeria, please.
Yes, good evening, everyone. So today, yes, I would like to present our joint paper with Vitaly. And this paper is about the cooperative strategies in the age of open innovation. So we look at three main points. So on the selection of partners, geography, and duration of cooperation. So in general, we all know that the generation of knowledge and ideas is a networks phenomenon. And if a single invention and its successful implementation can happen in isolation, then regular and systemic activities to develop and implement innovations are impossible without cooperation. That's why cooperative interactions between different actors are the core of modern models of innovative activities of firms, and also the basis of systematic approach to innovation in the country. But in contrast to the ideal situation in which all actors in the country implement the best strategies, in reality, interactions in branched innovation networks remain really exotic. So in our paper, using the data from surveys of Russian manufacturing enterprises, we study the phenomenon of cooperation and innovation, and try to answer two main questions. So what characterizes the cooperation relations of Russian manufacturing enterprises, and how various cooperation network configurations contribute to the innovation performance of these enterprises. So the basis for based on this data, various empirical studies have been conducted, and they form the spectrum of the hypotheses we use in our research. We all know that there are different forms of cooperation, and they have different effects on innovation performance of firms. Also, we know that these effects may vary greatly on the type of economic activity. And this paper, we focus only on manufacturing enterprises. Then we also have already some knowledge that the intensity and duration of cooperation usually have a significant effect on the, effectiveness of the interactions between partners. If we look at different partners of cooperation, we have to put an attention to the industry science cooperation, because still it plays a special role among other forms of cooperation. And this type of cooperation can really influence the innovation performance of firms. So in this study, we use two surveys of Russian manufacturing enterprises, which were conducted in 2015, where it covers all the industries in manufacturing, and also in 2018, focusing only on high-tech and medium high-tech enterprises. So the survey designs introduce the Oslo manual, so compliant metrics of innovation, and this makes our results really comparable with international and also interpretable in the context of international experience. So we used two types of the methodology. So first of all, we try to examine various configurations of cooperation networks in Russian manufacturing. Especially we focused on what is the role of industry science cooperation in this variety of cooperation networks. And then the second stage of the research, we looked what are the contributions of these configurations to the innovation performance of enterprises. And here we looked at two main indicators. So the novelty level of innovation and also the export activities of firms. And using the multinomial logic performance that cooperation takes an important place in innovation strategies of Russian manufacturing enterprises. So most of all enterprises cooperate with somebody, but the most common interaction model is still the vertical cooperation. So more than 70% of enterprises involve their clients and also their suppliers in the process of innovation development. But if we look at the types of enterprises, so based on their the novelty of innovation they create and their export activities, we see from the table that those who are exporters of their products, they usually cooperate also with science, with R&D organizations and universities. And this is distinctive features of these advanced innovators. If we look at the geographical features of these configurations of cooperation, we see that this vertical cooperation is mostly characterized by the regional and national suppliers and customers. So most of enterprises, they do not cooperate out of the region, and more or less they engage other types of partners in their cooperation networks. What we can conclude from analyzing the duration of cooperation, here we see that most of cooperation contracts in Russian manufacturing are largely ad hoc. So enterprises, they do not prefer to cooperate on a long-term basis. And here we decide that long-term means for us more than 5 years. And those who cooperate on a long-term basis, they are mostly also engaged in configurations involving various types of actors, also from academia and also from public authorities. But still, the amount of this type of cooperation is less than 6% from all types of configuration. So regarding also the, so here you can see the table that summarizes these various types of network configurations in Russian manufacturing. And here is much easier to see that only a few companies in Russia are engaged in this networking and prefer open strategies in creating innovation. Also, we can see that the geography of cooperation rarely extends beyond the region borders, and mostly enterprises cooperate on a short-term basis and only with Russian or domestic enterprises. At the second stage, as I already mentioned, we try to analyze what influence, what types or what characteristics of cooperation network influence the innovation activity of firms. And here we can see that, so first of all, in general, enterprises demonstrate the general low interest in creating new to market innovations and also entering foreign markets. And regarding the openness towards cooperation innovation, our analysis reveals a significant positive impact of extensive networking on the firm's innovation capabilities and output. So the main difference between advanced innovators, those who create innovation new to market, and those who export their products, is really the ability to establish and also maintain long-term links and intensive interaction with science. So this could be seen by the significant coefficients for those who cooperate with science and the types of enterprises, technological innovators. So enterprises involved in industry science cooperation, they are more likely to focus their strategies on innovation creation and export their activities. What we do also in our research, we try to understand what differs these enterprises who cooperate with science. So we understood that these enterprises are usually more innovative, but what are their features? And we got from our analysis that, first of all, these industries are more likely to focus their strategies from the beginning on innovation creation. They more often search for new client groups and want to extend their product lines. And what is also very important, these enterprises who cooperate with science, they more often create and disseminate their intellectual property rights. So they demonstrate higher intensity of the use of formal methods of protection, and also they are more often involved in the process of transferring this intellectual property objects. And this means that probably these types of enterprises are really, they are technology conductors in the national innovation system in the future. Coming to the conclusions and summing up what we got, it's also quite important to mention that we always check what are the general characteristics of these enterprises who prefer to cooperate and engage in a network more often. And here we see that firm size and the sector of activity, they play really a significant role again, and influence both the breadth and the intensity of cooperation. For the Russian case, it's necessary to mention that, of course, it's somehow it differs from other countries. And here we see that most of the innovation in Russian manufacturing happens, unfortunately, in a sort of open process. But the cooperation beyond the value chain is barely detectable. So again, enterprises prefer to cooperate more within the value chain with their suppliers, and clients prefer an ad hoc cooperation and do not cooperate beyond their region. At the same time, we see an important result that also is very important for the future policy recommendations, that it's really necessary to support the enterprises who already cooperate with academia, so with R&D organizations and universities, because this type of enterprises and this type of cooperation is really a distinctive for advanced innovators, those who can develop really advanced high innovations that are new to the market, and they are more often engaged in expert activities. But what we see also is the limited ability to develop and promote networks. So the share of enterprises who are engaged in broad networks is really low, and this, as we see, is really a factor that hampers the process of technological upgrading of the country in general. So here I think I will finish. So if you will have any questions after we will finish our session, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you.
Well, given your 5 minutes too early in closing, we can use the time already having some questions. I see one from Ian Myers. who is asking about government support or providing funding and things like that. Probably you see it as well. So what is the impact here from government side promoting these networks? Leah?
Yes, talking about the possible recommendations. So we think that it's really important to understand what are the strategies of cooperation and also innovative strategies of companies. So in fact, because this show us the possible trajectories of the development of the manufacturing enterprises, and also it's a basis for the development of future policy measures to support these organizations. So, and we see that the key of this of how we can intensify the networking and so technological upgrading, innovation activity, it really lies in the stimulation and stimulation of networking and stimulation of industry science cooperation in particular.
There's just one question open, which is the usual question in that context. What is the impact of such cooperation on the financial performance, on this economic sustainability and the economic performance of companies? So it's always nice to say,
sure.
okay, collaborate, but so what?
Of course, so it's one of the limitation of the data we use and we all have to analyze. But here, this study helps us somehow to proxy this economic and financial, so the sustainability of companies. So we use two indicators, the novelty of innovation and export activities. And probably we can somehow think that those who export, who work on international markets, these companies are, of course, more sustainable and more better performance.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's continue when we talk about policies here. Let's continue and ask Michael Kiel what he finds for the STIP compass. Oh no, sorry, for the STI outlook about innovation policies fighting the COVID and related issues. So, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. I'm just going to share my screen.
I'm sorry, I messed up Outlook and Compass. So.
Well, they used to be the same thing years ago, but we split them. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the OECD STI outlook today and highlight some of the key messages that are emerging from this. For those of you who don't know what the STI outlook is, it's a biennial publication. It comes out every 2 years from the OECD. It looks at latest trends and issues relevant to STI policy, that's science, technology, innovation policy. And it also attempts to take some sort of forward-looking perspective, though I have to say it doesn't tend to do this in a very systematic or foresight way, but still there is some sort of forward-looking perspective there. The latest edition is dedicated largely to the response and the impacts on science and innovation activities regarding COVID-19, so no big surprise there. And these points here, which I'll just quickly run through, give you a sense of the overall narrative. So firstly, the pandemic, of course, has triggered an unprecedented mobilization of science and innovation and has also underlined more than in other recent crises the importance of science and innovation to both being prepared and reactive to upcoming crises. It's also those stretched research innovation systems to their limits, and it's also revealed those areas that need strengthening, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But also it presents STI policy with an opportunity, policymakers, research organizations, businesses, to really take on board some of these big challenges. The green transitions, for example, is one, digitalization is another. So we have this moment where those could, they could move more center stage in policy making. And this has, the book has a dual format. So normally it comes out only as a book, but this time we also have various web resources as well. So just to dive in a little bit on the story here, while research and innovation, like everything else, has been severely disrupted by things like lockdowns and social distancing measures. And here there's a little bit of survey data from a survey we run in the OECD of scientists. So around 3,000 scientists have answered the survey over the last few months. And you can see more than 3/4 of them have indicated that at some point during the crisis, they've had to shift to home working. Another thing that's interesting here is about 1 in 6 of them have also shifted to covering COVID-19 related topics within their research. Now, these impacts have been uneven, and of course, those who are suffering the most tend to be the early career researchers. And in our survey, again, we see that more than half of the scientists, not only early career researchers, there were others as well, thought that the crisis would actually decrease job security and career opportunities. So we already have a bad situation, and the crisis is perhaps going to make it even worse. If we then look at some of the research activities that have responded to COVID-19, we see a very impressive increase or a reaction or response to the crisis in the first few months. So between March and the end of June, government spent about 5 billion euros on research dedicated just to COVID. And then there was some other international money on top of that, which of course national governments were contributing to as well. But then if you look after that period from July onwards, you see this kind of plateaus out somewhat. And what's happened is that after this emergency response, a lot of the COVID research is now has been mainstreamed, if you like, in regular calls for research. So this kind of sharp increase you see in these early months of the crisis are really just showing you the emergency responses, the calls that were dedicated just to COVID that were put out there on top of the regular calls that were being made around all of the research landscape. Also, that's of course the input, the money, but what does the output look like? Well, COVID again has triggered really an unprecedented mobilization of the scientific community. You see here the number of publications that have been produced. The last count when we last looked at the end of October was around 70,000 publications in PubMed dealing with COVID. And what's also interesting here is that of these 70,000, 76% are open access. And if you compare that to other biomedical fields like diabetes and dementia, this is quite a big difference. And it could be then that perhaps COVID offers a moment where we can perhaps really progress to a truly open science. If we look then at business innovations, up until now I've been talking mostly about public research. On the business innovation front, again, there's a lot of uneven impacts here. This piece of evidence here shows the number of startups in the United States. The red line shows the decline of startups during the financial crisis, the global financial crisis 11, 12 years ago. And you see that the blue line shows that, in fact, at least in the first 9 months of the year, there was a decline in the spring with a number of startups, but that over the summer, they shot up again quite sharply. And of course, it could be because lots of people were made unemployed and had to start their own businesses, or it could be something else. So we cannot read too much into this data, but nevertheless, it does show that we don't see the same pattern as we saw in the global financial crisis. And if we look at other evidence here, if we look at R&D expenditures in a few selected companies, some of the big players there, and we see that the GAFA, the Facebooks, the Apples, Alphabet, and so on, they are spending more on R&D than they were a year ago. And then if we compare those to the manufacturing companies, the R&D intensive manufacturing companies, particularly the automotive companies, aerospace, you can see that they're spending less. And of course, this doesn't surprise us. We know looking at their revenues that most companies, of course, are funding R&D from their revenues. This is a pattern that we would expect to see. And if we look then at venture capital here, again, this is only looking up until July. We saw a decrease in the number of deals, but not such a sharp decrease in the value of those deals. And finally, I mean, that's looking at some of the impacts, but we can also look at some of the responses. We've got quite a bit of data here looking at the number of clinical trials related to COVID, and this one just looks at vaccine. We also have stuff on therapeutics as well. You can see that there's a lot of this, a lot of trials launched over the last year or so, after the last 9 months, I should say. And you can see that these are spread across many countries. So Russian Federation here is in the top 5 as well, though of course the United States accounts by far the most, and this is even more extreme. In fact, if you look at the therapeutics, the United States accounts for about half of all of the clinical trials. So that's a kind of quick snapshot of the state of play of what's happened over the last few months, some of the reactions, but also some of the impacts. If we want to look forward, though, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty out there still. We're now in the midst of a second wave. There are perhaps vaccines that will become available in a matter of weeks. We don't know, of course, to what extent those will be rolled out in time. And in the meantime, because of various lockdowns and other measures, we're seeing even further disruption to economies, to societies, and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty. We're still, in a way, in the early days, particularly when you take into account that there's a lot of government stimulus at the moment to try and keep things afloat. When that's withdrawn, we don't know what will happen either. So what we've tried to do in the outlook is to look at some of these key uncertainties insofar as they will shape research and innovation activities. So I'm going to quickly just run through the 3 here that are in green. So I'm going to look at the future orientation of STI policy, the international relations and global order, and the pace of direction of digitalization. I won't look at the other 3 for now because of the interest of time. So if we look at government reaction, government expenditure, government priorities, this is a key uncertainty here. So if we look at this graph here, we can see that over the last 30 years or so, government priorities for R&D expenditure are very much shifted towards industrial innovation. And you can see that the other areas like health and society, the environment, security are rather flatlined. It could be, of course, that because of the pandemic, even before the pandemic, there were lots of calls for sustainability, green transitions, that we might see a change here. So we may see that planet and infrastructure, health and society get a lot more funding in the next few years, but we can't be sure of this. If you look at the recovery packages that have been announced over the last few months, many of them include R&D expenditures as one of the priorities. Many of them emphasize, though, at the same time, sustainability, resilience, inclusivity, central themes. But then do countries have the right policy mix in order to have that sort of directionality in order to address things like sustainability and inclusivity? And one could argue that they don't, that perhaps over the last 15 years, they've gone too far towards horizontal types of policy measures, indirect measures, such as tax incentives. And I think this graph here shows quite well the very sharp increase in the use of tax incentives over the last 12 or 13 years or so, which is accompanied by a sharp decrease in direct measures. So it could be, I think it's not a question of could, but if governments want to be more directive, it probably means that they're going to have to be investing much more in direct measures, things like grants, and less in tax incentives. But at the end of the day, well, governments have money, so I'm talking about the priorities they may have, the directions they may set, but let's also look at their indebtedness. If we look at the previous slide there, I've circled here the government response to the global financial crisis. We saw there's a very sharp increase in direct measures, really to give a boost to research and innovation, particularly in firms. And of course, this is showing the support to firms here, but this rapidly dropped off in the years of austerity that followed. And it could be that that's also what we're going to face here as well, that right now, and maybe for the next year or so, we'll see We'll see some generous increases in R&D expenditures, but these will not stand the test of time. Austerity will kick in simply because of the level of indebtedness and the threat of sovereign debt crises. If we move on to another key uncertainty, the geopolitical landscape, of course, it's not even the elephant in the room here. Everybody knows that China is a major disruptor. This is an interesting graph here that you see 20 years ago, China had spent a similar amount on research as France. And now it spends close to the United States level in 2018. And I think it's projected by about 2022, it will surpass the United States in the amount of funding it gives to research. On top of that, though, I mean, China is not sitting outside of the international research system. It's very much embedded, in fact. And if you look just at the COVID research that's done, I'm sorry, you probably can't see this very clearly, but for the United States, the biggest partner, if you look at co-publications, is China. 4% of all research done, or research published in PubMed by American authors is with a Chinese co-author, while in China, 10% of their publications are co-authored with a US author. And just to put these numbers into perspective, United States, about 25% of its publications are co-authored with an international co-author. So China is embedded, you could say, but there's also concerns about a lack of if I can say this word properly, reciprocity in these relationships, and this threatens their future. This is something which we're picking up now from a lot of OECD member countries. And finally, on the another third key uncertainty is the pace and direction of digitalization. So it's an obvious point that's been made many times that the crisis has accelerated the use of digital technologies for things like telework, e-learning, and e-commerce. But the question is to what extent these will permanently change the nature of work, the nature of learning, the nature of shopping, and so on. This is a piece of interesting information from a survey done by the European Foundation, an outfit that Ian and Raphael and myself did a lot of work for around 20 years ago on Foresight when I was at Manchester. And here you can see they've done one of the biggest surveys of workers, and they found that if they look at all employees, around 2/3 express a preference to telework at least several times a month, and 45% express that preference for several times a week. So the question is to what extent preferences like that will then feed through, of course, into long-term changes. There's uncertainty about that. If we look here, though, at patenting, and this is looking at patent applications to the US Patent Office that support work from home technologies. Looking at over the last 10 years, you can see a very sharp increase that coincides with the lockdown. So we can expect, of course, that such arrangements will also drive and co-evolve with advances in technological innovation. Okay, so I'm almost done. So what are the prospects for STI? Is there a need for a new deal for STI policy? Well, the COVID moment offers an opportunity to transition to more sustainable, equitable, and resilient societies. And STI can play important roles in this transition. Governments will not be able to act alone, of course, to drive that sort of transition. It's something that has to be done with business, with civil society organizations as well. Focusing just on the business side, recovery packages will need to include a mix of measures to incentivize the private sector to invest in appropriate research and innovation. And governments will also need to reduce uncertainty for firms by signaling intended public sector investments, but also the future demand commitments in support of these sort of transition goals that lay often at the center of their recovery packages. So just to say that, as I said, there's this dual format of the Outlook. We have this book, which will come out shortly, but we also have several web pages that look at particular topics. A couple of examples here is scientific advice in times of COVID, and another here on the precarity of research careers. We're making more of these pages all of the time. Currently, there are 6 of these pages, but there'll probably be another 6 up by January, February next year. So this is something that's a kind of rolling program of content. And in addition to the outlook, and Dirk mentioned at the start of the presentation, the STIP Compass. So as a sort of, STIP Compass is a big database that the OECD maintains with the European Commission. We have about 6,000 policy initiatives in there from more than 50 countries. But as an extension of that, we've also been collecting information, data on countries' responses, policy responses to COVID. And currently we have around 600 or 700 policy initiatives in a separate data collection. And we've built various sort of interactive dashboards where you can search and interact with that data, filter it in different ways. That will be, there's a version of this database that's already there. It's been up for the last 7 or 8 months. We've now got a new tranche of data, and we've got these new dashboards, which don't yet appear on the website, but these will be launched in a matter of weeks. So that's a useful resource. The data is all free for anyone to download themselves. There's an open API on the database, so you can also dial into that and pull the latest data into your own systems as well. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Right, thanks, Michael. I see a number of questions in the chat. The first comes from Alexander Sokolov, who's asking if the figures differ significantly across countries. So
I didn't catch the question. Sorry again.
Do the figures differ significantly across countries? Maybe Alexander, you can give a short word.
Yeah, because we see a lot of figures, Michael, about influence of the situation on R&D, and you gave only average figures. Do they differ significantly for different states?
They do, yes, but I don't have the data at hand. It's my Global Science Forum colleagues who have collected that data. And you can actually, they have, if you go to that COVID Watch site that on my last slide, if you visit there, there's a link to the data set as well that they've put together, where you can see what different countries what sort of schemes they've put in place in order to respond to COVID. But you need to be a bit careful with that data, though, and that goes back to the point I was making earlier on, that it's quite good at reflecting what happened in the first few months when there were very sort of discrete sorts of initiatives to get, to give a boost to the research effort. So there were a lot of new policies established, but what happened then from the summer onwards, a lot of these calls became embedded in the usual sorts of calls, the usual programs, and so it becomes invisible almost. So unless you get into doing big sort of data analytics and data mining of the administrative data of the research funding agencies, which you can do, of course, as well, but which we haven't done. But because it's a bit invisible, there's something of a measurement effect here, I would say, in that particular chart. So I think we're quite accurate in collecting what happened in the first 3 or 4 months, but after that, from the summer onwards, I don't think that gives a very good estimate of how governments are funding research targeted at COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we have a rather long comment by Ian. Ian Myers. Ian, maybe you give a word. Ian? Maybe we lost you.
No, I was muted. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike. One thing I wonder is whether OECD, you have looked at the more social research, because I'm aware that there's a lot of funding going to some R&D firms in Britain, that's how I know, on behavioral issues, like what's people's reactions to public policy, how do we get the right messages, how are we going to make sure that people want to be vaccinated rather than not being, and so on and so forth. There are many, there seem to be many initiatives of this sort. I'm wondering if you're picking these up as well.
Yeah, so we are, but we're not separating them out, if you like. They're bundled with all of the other stuff currently, at least in our directorate, Science, Technology, Innovation Policy. But I think there are other parts of the house, other parts of the organization that have kind of honed in on that stuff and are analyzing it. Particularly, we have another directorate that looks at the impact on government itself. So they're collecting a lot of data on that, and again, that data is open as well. So I can circulate the link to that. But I think there will be others as well that will be looking at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maxime Kotzemir is strongly interested in Russia. Maxime, maybe you explain what you want to know. Maxime?
Okay, I can, dear Michael, thank you for your very interesting presentation. So my first brief question about the map of co-authorship of countries. What is the place of Russia? You shown to us some map with US, China and other countries, but I don't see Russia on this map. The map of network of countries in COVID research.
Yeah, I don't have the data at hand, but as you say, you can't. Russia is not very present. We covered all countries. It's there. It's on the map, but it isn't very large compared to the big dominant players that are there. But you did see, on the other hand, that if you look at the clinical trials for vaccine, Russia is in the top 5. But if you look at the volume of papers that are in PubMed, which, I mean, you have to also realize that all of these databases have their limitations as well, and so they often, for example, tend to favor English language publications. They're also they also favor American publications over other publications. So we cannot take this as being as being gospel, as we would say. I mean, it's not the full truth, if you like, but it gives nevertheless quite a good approximation of what's going on, with caveats. And as I say, Russia is not one of the major players here, as you could see from the chart. But it could be that most Russian researchers are publishing in Russian and maybe in Russian language journals, and a lot of that will be missed by PubMed.
Okay, and my other question, does OECD have monitoring some real-time indicators of influence of coronavirus on R&D activity? Again, for example, what is the speed of submission of publications to journal? Do we see the extension of peer review period? Do you have such statistics?
Yeah, we're not monitoring that, but but it's an important issue, and what we've tended to do, looking at that, is basically looked at the literature. There are others that have analysed that and have analysed PubMed, for example, to see how quickly things were published, how quickly they went through journals. There's also a lot of work looking also at preprints as well, at how quickly those have come out, how quickly they were then published, how many were retracted, and so on. We haven't done any of that research ourselves, but there are quite a lot of other people that are doing that, and which we're citing in the Outlook.
Okay, thank you for your question, for your answers.
Okay, Michael, thanks a lot. We should continue with the next presentation, and we will come back for a short discussion around at the end of the session. So next is Valentina Boyakova and Konstantin Forsa. So who's presenting today, Valentina or Kostya?
Hello, Dirk. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to make this presentation, and give me a second just to share my screen.
It's a nice screen now, looks like.
I left from the nesting group meeting. Okay. I hope I will switch to, can you see my screen now in the demonstration mode? Great, fantastic. So Hello, everyone again. I'm going to talk about our digital dreams, or I would say broken digital dreams. I would say that my presentation is going to be quite optimistic because, with this, within the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to look more carefully on what is happening in the country against the ongoing digital transformation processes. But to start with, I will touch upon slightly on some motives for measuring public perception and engagement in science and technology in general, and will address some issues related to digital transformation of everyday life and the I would say social response to this to these changes, and eliminate some digital divide challenges and some aspects of people readiness for a complete digitalization. I'm going to use different sources of information. So this will be a combination of statistical data, our previous research, and some recent studies we completed, and I would say some of them are ongoing. As a foreword, I used the quotation from William Thomas, his famous Thomas theorem, that says that if men define situation as real, they are real in their consequences. So we depend a lot on our perception of reality, on our future expectations. And therefore, as long as people remain the key player in the science and technology development, in economic development, there is a need to look carefully on these expectations, these perceptions and awareness of the change. Because in the end, people are taking decisions and they shape the future they are going to live in. So therefore, we need some indicators for the social and economic impact of science and technology to identify some perception and the level of acceptance of these new and promising technologies. In the end, to provide some evidence for policymaking and recommendations on public-oriented policymaking. So, as I said, society remains the key player of the digital economy. Here are the recent estimates. We see that in Russia, around 3.7% of GDP is driven by digital technologies, and nearly half of the expenditure are those coming from households, from the end users of digital technologies. So they spend on telecommunication services, some particular digital tools or content, in fact, over 40, but a little bit, yeah, I just rounded it here. So around 40% of the total expenditure on digital economy development. However, who are these people, what they do, what kind of digital practices they use, and how we can work with this is still a question to most of the policymaking. And what is actually moving forward or holding back the digitalization of society. So currently we see that the significant part of Russian users, in fact, is engaged with different types of digital technologies. Most of these are internet driven, and of course, most of these are online. These figures are coming from 2019, and I would say that currently in the pandemic period, I'm sure these figures will rise up significantly. But we will see them only, I would say, the first quarter of the next year. So what people do in the internet. So they search for information, they communicate, they live their lives. They try to find some support for navigation. They use public services, they buy or sell products. So digital environment becoming, I would say normal for most of the people. However, as a context picture, we see that new technologies change human lives very quickly, and most of our respondents accept this. Moreover, we see that there are more and more risks around new technologies, and they may be exploited by intruders or may have different consequences for human being in general and for the environment. We observe more cases about actually violation of human rights, in particular related to personal information, and so on. So therefore, there is a question, so how people will react. To illustrate this, I will make one step backwards to our previous study from 2015, where we tried to assess the potential, I would say, interest to the future products. Most of this that you see on your screens now are available for end users. But in general, we see that 5 years ago, they were not so high interest to most of them. So we can see that the highest interest was to the solar battery on the roof, but it is still around 50% of the total population. However, those marked with red are digital-driven technologies, and most of them are available on the market and are quite well used. This means that people, and in particular Russian populations, because we see here some comparisons with the European Union averages, are mostly interested in affordable technologies that are applicable in their everyday life. And the less demand is demonstrated towards ethically ambiguous and potentially unsafe technologies. This graph demonstrates the results of the correspondence analysis. We asked not only about the willingness to try the technology, but only about the reasons for non-using it. And here, the size of the bubbles demonstrate the initial willingness, and the axes are about the motives for refusing the technology. And we see that together with the need, we see also some other motives. So the clearness of a technology or disturbance, potential disturbance of this, and those technologies that are close to the human body, like gene diagnostics or some implanted devices for health control, artificial meat, that are also in our reality currently. They are less interesting to people, and they are perceived as most disturbing ones. Among other motives, we see the attempts to assess the potential efficiency of technologies. So now we have tested self-driving cars, and we have car sharing technologies. We don't have the car sharing particularly on these slides, but we had them in the list, and they were not accepted. But today we see that the markets for the car sharing is growing very fast. Telemedicine is another example where we see a huge growth of interest due to, I would say, forced digitalization, in particular driven by this pandemic period. So if we look back to our initial question on the digital technologies and digital divide, we see that despite the fact that we have a new generation that has already grown up in the digital area and might feel themselves quite comfortable in the digital environment. And there are still groups that are cut off these digital technologies, and the dissemination of these technologies are not equal among different social groups. Moreover, we can see that those users that are active in, for example, internet usage, demonstrate quite a basic level of skills. And the older these people are, the less, the more problems they have with using these technologies. Moreover, we observe some regional polarization. In the central regions, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, there are around 2 times ahead of other regions in their readiness to use digital technologies, the variety of digital technologies. This is a challenge because digital technologies are addressed to increase the connection between people that are apart from the central parts. But this is not only about technical part. This is also about the readiness to use it. There is a paradox that in Russia, the main motive for people aged 40 and above for refusing the use of internet, for example, is their unwillingness to do this. So it's not about the problem with the lack of skills or not understanding. This is just a lack of desire to try something new. So that's quite a problematic thing, I would say. Therefore, we don't have a quite understanding what to do with such people. So how to motivate them to get into the new digital environment. And these people are under risk because they are still economically active and they have to work in the digital environment. However, we see that the traditional markets are changing and labor market is changing as well. There are some prognostic figures that say that by 2030, about 14% of the global workforce will have to change their careers due to digitalization processes. I think that the current figures are even higher. And we see that together with the change of the current labor market structures, new professions will appear. And they will require new skills and new types of training. The question, however, is that will the education system be able to reconstruct these processes from the teaching side and provide the newcomers to the area of education with the necessary skills and knowledge? Another slice of data from our last year's survey about the perception of these future changes. We see that half of the population, in fact, agree that robots will soon replace them in most of the jobs. And the most vulnerable groups in this competition are services and trade workers, unskilled or lower qualified personnel. And another paradox is that these people are excluded from the lifelong learning processes. So they do not try to compensate the lack of skills using current digital driven based education. So therefore they are under a higher risk. What can they do? They can train as IT or IT related specialists, and we see that formally for the forthcoming generation, this profession is about to become more and more popular. And it goes in line with the very popular until recently, the profession of economist. It was one of the most popular in Russia for until recently. However, what kind of skills they may need? So this is just a professional education, or the structure of skills are also changing. Definitely, yes. So new economy requires new, not only new skills, but new combination of skills. These are not only hard and soft, these are also digital skills that change due to specialization. And again, currently we see that even most qualified personnel, doctorate holders, they are not always, how to say, ready to use the professional terminology related to digitalization. So they know such words as big data, machine learning, but they are not engaged with the use of this. And this is the most, let's say, proficient group. So the question is then how existing educational institutions will be able to provide training for not only for professionals, but only for those who want to train their digital skills or advance their digital competencies. Because in the end, they need to rise up their human capital. So I am almost at the end of my presentation, and I want to put this for questions for further discussion. So we see that despite the widespread of the digital technologies and many services that are digitally based, we see not only, we see more people who are cut off these changes. And moreover, those who are steadily distancing themselves from innovations and probably will not become users of digital devices in the nearest future. People perceive technologies differently, and they perceive that their life is changing quickly. However, they are not ready to change themselves, and this is a shock to them and quite risk for future policymaking. Therefore, any significant digital change might just pass unnoticed. New technologies as perceived not only a source of future benefits, but also a source of future risks. And in this growing negative trend, there is a risk that many innovations may remain unaddressed. Therefore, there is a need to pay attention to the social side of policymaking. And I would support Jens' comment here, who asked about the social dimension of policymaking. Yes, definitely. We think mostly about the technical part, about the heart, but we need now to think more about the people, because people are in the end those who use it and who will move it further. This is it. Thank you for your attention. I hope I'm in time, and will happy to answer your questions if there are any.
Thank you, Konstantin. Almost on time, 1 minute overdue, but it doesn't matter in the end. So wonderful, interesting speech with nice, interesting insights into the population issues. I think we had an extremely interesting, compact session this afternoon for 2 hours. We raised a lot of questions. We don't have the answers yet. Of course not. It will take quite a while for finding the answers, and business as usual. When the academics provide an answer, the problem is solved already somehow. So hopefully the pandemic is gone when we find the answers. I would open the floor now for further additional questions, especially to Konstantin, where you didn't have a chance otherwise to raise your issues. Either you type the question or you simply raise your hands, and I see it here in the participants list, and you can raise the question. Okay, so feel free. This is probably one phenomenon we see now. This is people are reluctant to new technology. So you don't want to use the technology raising your hands. It's good. We can take it as a sociology experiment, which we are running here right away now. Otherwise, I understand it's getting a bit late, and 4 hours long talk the same. I think If that's so, let's conclude here. We have 3 more days to go. And you know Konstantin Forsov, you can also address him by email like all the others. What I saw, there's one general question, probably Alexander and Elena, you can respond. Will the PowerPoints, the presentations be made available to everybody?
I will respond to this question. It will depend on the willingness of authors of presentations to share them. If they agree, so we will be sharing the presentations. No problem.
Okay, so thank you very much, and have a nice evening, have a nice day, a nice morning, probably not. We don't have Eastern
Dirk, I had a couple of questions for Mike. I don't know if you read them, but I wonder if he's still online, if he has read them, if he could answer some.
That wasn't very long, so just feel free. Go ahead.
Mike, are you still online? I cannot see your face. So
yes, he's online. He's muted.
I'm muted though, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I'm still online, yes. Your questions, Rafa, one was about Nordic countries, right? And Ibero-America.
Ibero-America, plus also, how do you handle the informal economy in your conclusions, which is huge, massive in some regions of the world. So yeah. Can you please, I don't know, provide some insights from OECD? How do you handle those there?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say that the outlook is only 100 pages. It's not something that can cover all of these things. So they're on our radar. We've done a lot of work in the past on inclusive innovation, which has looked at frugal innovation and the like, which are very important here as well. Of course, we see already evidence of various sort of makers coming up with responses to the shortage of masks and even ventilators, for example. So at the moment, we haven't looked in any sort of systematic way at the informal economy or at this more sort of frugal innovations. But this is something we plan to do over the next year or so. So the outlook has nothing to say on this, I would say, except it does mention that this is a dimension, but it doesn't have any analysis to say anything in addition to that. Then on the questions about the country breakdown, we haven't looked at particular regions or groupings. We basically just put the data out as it is right now. Insofar as there is data as well, of course, I mean, if you look at a lot of traditional OECD statistics, there's a big lag time. So the new data that's been published around research expenditures, for example, from the OECD is dated 2018, and this is normal. There's always an 18-month lag. So we have to find other ways to be able to pick up what's going on now, or in the last few months at least. But then you're in the realms of the data being less reliable, and then you need to be much more careful, particularly if you're the OECD, to say that, well, this is the situation in the United States, or this is the situation in Sweden. So we still give, if you like, a sort of general picture, an aggregate picture, if you like, and are a little bit wary of, given the shortage of data right now, to say anything that's definitive about what particular countries are doing.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to do, to add some kind of footnote or very strong note on the limitations of data analytics in this type of analysis. Because one is the data availability, another is the data quality, and another thing is the size of the economy. Even in developed countries, I have witnessed there's some degree of informal economy that is happening in some so-called very, very highly developed countries. So it would be good that this, at least insights, are reflected there, so that people don't draw wrong conclusions.
Well, I think OECD knows exactly how to handle these issues. Usually we make a nice statement that there is something behind, but here we also have to rely upon the data and the information delivered by the country. So OECD is not collecting the data themselves. So it's the question what the countries provide in terms of information to OECD. So we need to be aware of that, and certainly the weaknesses of the data sets, they are pretty well known, like for any other data set. That is certainly also an issue and a problem which holds true for any kind of data set, any survey, and whatever we do. Still, I highly appreciate the outlook and the compass as well, since it's besides the statistics, it's a huge compilation of policy initiatives which you hardly find in such a comparable shape anywhere else. I agree, we should not start comparing the number of policy initiatives on a certain field. It doesn't make much sense. But at least you have kind of a compendium, and from where you can have a good look for further analysis. This is fully agree. Okay, so well, I see we are right in time now, and we should close the session. Unfortunately, we don't have a reception today. Maybe we have a virtual reception with a bottle of champagne for everybody, and we have a virtual toast and raise the glasses for our nice session. I assume in a year's time we will be back in Moscow and going to a bar, going to a reception or for dinner. Right now, I promise by that time in a year it will be as dark as it is now already outside. Okay, thank you very much for the fruitful discussion. It's always my pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you.
Live long and prosper.
Bye bye.
Live long and prosper.
Thank you.
May I just invite, excuse me, last message. I would like to invite you, because we hold this conference the whole week, and for tomorrow we have 2 sessions. And the first one will be at noon Moscow time. It will be devoted to how to measure innovation in cities, different approach, new approaches and new data sources. And the second one will be at 3 o'clock Moscow time. It will be a special workshop, prospects of science and technology in BRICS countries. We'll have presenters from all BRICS states. So you are kindly invited, and I would like to thank all presenters for absolutely excellent presentations. And so it's a great pleasure for us as hosts to have such good stuff in our conference. Thank you very much, and hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Thanks for organizing. Bye.
Bye-bye.